I'm Sue Corbin. Welcome to our book club meeting tonight on July 19th. We're going to be talking about a wonderful book tonight, and one that is very dear to my heart, A Land of Books by Duncan Tonatiuh, or if you are speaking it in Spanish, it's Duncan Tonatiuh. And I found out that his name actually means son or god of the sun. So a pretty important name. He does shed a lot of light on things. So I love this book because it reminds me of the power of recording and passing along stories to other generations. It seems as though human beings need to leave a legacy, whether it's the planting of trees or the establishment of a business or an institution. It might be a building, an invention, could be a song or a painting or a book. But the sting of our mortality seems to be eased by the immortality of our bequest to the future. And in A Land of Books, the narrator suggests that the spirits of the people will remain in the paintings of the words as their bodies perish, their essence will continue. Duncan Tonatiuh has gifted us with really more than a dozen books, and he's only in his 30s, I believe, still. And they are all illustrated in his signature style that is reminiscent of his Mesoamerican roots. His topics cover traditional Mesoamerican folk tales and creation myths, biographies of famous Mesoamerican people, and his favorite called Dear Primo, which is a letter to his cousin about living in different places and yet being part of a larger community. A Land of Books is unusual because it overtly celebrates the legacy of Mesoamerican people in the form of codices, most of which unfortunately are no more. It is a book that honors the past and looks to the future so that contemporary children can know who they are and carry on the spirits of their people. So the actual complete title of the book, are you all familiar with the book? Kind of, yes, okay.
Yes.
So, all right, good. It is a book about the Mexica, I think I'm saying that correctly, word painters. And I love that term, word painters. So I'm going to be just giving a little bit of background of Aztec codices. I have a fun little activity for you to see if you can try to figure out how to read some pictographs. We'll be talking about a few ways to use this book in a classroom, which we normally do in our special interest group. And then I have some questions for us to think about and discuss, and that will be our evening. So the Aztec codices are from the pre-Columbian and the colonial era. There were still some codices being produced during the colonial era, but many of them were overseen by Spanish priests and conquistadores who wanted the indigenous people to record stories, but to incorporate their new religion that was being imposed upon them. The codices were made up of pictographs, which are pictures of objects, and ideographs, which are pictures of concepts. And they recorded the history of the culture, where they came from and how they settled into their land which now is Mexico City. The rituals that they had were recorded, calendars, genealogies for families, even business records, as well as stories were written down. And they were done either on separate sheets of paper or on these accordion folded pieces of paper that acted a little like scrolls. These were made out of bark. Sometimes they were written down on deer hides, or they might be written down on cloth, or even on stone. They might be recorded on the walls of the buildings. And of course, we don't have those anymore. They were all painted by scribes who went to school for this, and they were well educated. But other people could become scribes besides the well-educated people. Sometimes people, as the narrator and his family in this story, were not from the noble class, but they were chosen to become word painters. Sorry for the popping sounds. So when you're reading pictographs and ideographs, there are some things that you have to take into consideration. You have to have a really deep understanding of the cultural context of the stories, because without knowing what the pictures are, you really can't determine what they mean. So you have to be able to identify what an object is. You have to be able to read the symbols. So if you see a body wrapped in cloth, that equals death. You could sort of infer that, but you can't with all of the pictures, I've found. It's interesting because today we use pictographs for special needs children so that they can communicate either on paper or on devices. And also we use emojis. I think it's interesting that, we think we've come so far with technology, but really we're kind of going backwards, because we do scroll through our screens on our computers, just like we scrolled our parchments, and we're using pictures once again to express ideas. I was fortunate enough to attend a webinar that the International Literacy Association put on last week with Duncan Tonatiuh and other authors there. And he talked a little bit about how not everyone was literate in pictographs. You would think that, well, they're part of the culture. Why couldn't they read the codices? Well, they couldn't all. So in order for everyone to be able to share in what and to understand what was on the codices, they would organize book readings. And I really love this idea during festivals and rituals, so that a singer would sing the stories, especially those that were done in poetry form. And dancers would dance and they would burn incense to create a mood. I want to go to a book reading like that sometime. I don't know about you, but I think that would be a great happening. So I found this online. It's from an article titled Becoming Visually Literate, Reading and Writing an Aztec Codex by a grad student, Rebecca Hart, published by the UC Riverside, part of the Gluck Fellows program. And she presents us with this pictograph with different pictures and has asked us some questions. And I'm just going to throw this out to you and see, what do you think some of these things mean? What do you think the L-shaped boxes might mean? What about the footprints here? What do you think two people pointing at each other might mean? And here's a structure. What is that? How about these little L shapes? What about double lumps? And then there are these, what she calls pokeball symbols. So I'm just going to throw it out there. Do you have any idea of what these things might mean?
My first thought on the footprints was for the reader to go from this part of the story to this part to the next part of the story, rather than to go down. So we're instructed as readers to go across, but and the characters are not the same. So it's not the character who goes across, right? This is my sense. It's somebody else. What if the people who are creating this are talking to the reader or the storyteller? Go this way.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good observation. I love it.
I'm looking at the L-shaped boxes, and within the one and the L-shaped box in the top left, there's a face in there inside it. And I'm wondering, is this something that's describing if somebody has passed away, if it's some kind of funeral story, a family story, or a genealogy? And the two little bumps are indicated to be like some kind of counting.
Interesting.
Because they're repeated down in the lower left too. There's a similar two little bumps on the bottom lower left box.
Mm-hmm.
So it's repeated.
Good point. Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, maybe the age of the person when they passed away, or yeah, it's good.
With the finger pointing, my first response is, I don't know how universal he said, you said, the arguing, pointing fingers at one another is. But what if that gesture of combat, that adversary gesture of you said, no, you said, no, you said, that sort of adversary stance of argument might be involved here, because the two folks have these big, they're very regal. They've had these huge headgear on them, which makes me think that they're two leaders. They're very powerful people, and they're coming in contact and they're arguing about something. That's just my thought, because it's the finger pointing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Either challenging, you promised, or you did this, or you did this and said you wouldn't do this, or you want my daughter to marry your son. Something that is meant to be challenging.
I always love your drama, Sandeep. You're just great. But you're right. Yeah, it's true. Shame on you also. What about this building here? Any idea what that structure is? I mean, the whole thing kind of reminds me of something out of Dr. Seuss, the Butter Battle book. Remember? One of the machines made to kill. I don't know. The Aztecs, as the Mayans, were, a little combative. It's interesting because both when I was in Nicaragua, we visited a Mayan ruin, and there was a game court there that is very similar to something the Aztecs would have had. That was a ball game. It was sort of like basketball, only the circle that you had to put the ball through came out of the side of the wall, and you had to try to get the small ball through this little hole, and you couldn't use your hands. You had to use your head or your elbow. and or your shoulder. So it was really hard to do. And in both cultures, the losers paid a huge price by either the entire team being executed or just the captain of the team. So you did not want to lose those games. So very interesting. So you give up?
I'm really curious about these little strings of multicolored beads or balls
Yes.
that are everywhere. It's like a price tag hanging off of things.
Ah.
And they're attached to all these little tiny objects, and then exactly like they're attached with a little line.
You're right. Yeah, I hadn't seen it before.
They're kind of screaming at me. I'm really curious about what those are.
Yeah.
Because I think those might be a key to what this is all about.
It very well could be. And unfortunately, she does not give us that information. I guess we have to dig a little deeper. I know.
So, Sue, I have a question. In this codice, is that that yellow box? Is that the way it is depicted in the illustration, or is that
something that Rebecca put in there just to sort of point it out?
Okay.
Yeah. So let me show you the next screen. So here we can see that these L-shaped boxes mean a place of.
Okay.
So this could be a place of burial, right? And then these little feet talk about traveling. Some people were traveling. And can you see what this is up at the top of the screen? What these people are?
It looks like a kind of a head crown or something.
Right, but can you see what her explanation is or not? Is that
a marriage?
A marriage.
Which, when you were talking about, I just kept thinking, oh, that is so funny because some marriages are like very small. Yeah. And then what is this?
Oh, it's a temple.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking it might be, but I was interpreting it because we lived in Japan for a long time and I saw the red crossbars, and in Japan those are tories, which are gates to shrines. And they mark the division between the mortal and the mundane and the spiritual.
Interesting.
And I saw that, and that's where I went, but then I'm like, well, that interpretation could be way off here. So
yeah. Well, yeah, looking at it from a Japanese perspective, but you can use that to make a connection here, which is really interesting. And we were talking about how it looks like a weapon in the Butter Battle book, but when you think about the temples, that's where a lot of sacrifices were made. So there was some violence that happened there, and then these would be the little steps leading up to it. Although probably what's happening here is a marriage in the temple that day. These people are probably traveling to the wedding from a place of wherever they were at. The double lumps are stones, and she doesn't really go into much more detail about what stones were there for. But these are stars here, and I really wish now, Christine, you have me really concerned about what these are.
Now I've done it.
Yeah, thanks. You've just given me some homework, which is just what I needed. But no, I have to find out now. I mean, it looks like they're cooking a chicken in a pot here, or maybe then this is the reception. Who knows? But I think it's fun to take a look at these, and can you see how children would be engaged in an activity like this, because we were having fun with it, right? And I think kids really love to be able to read pictures like that. One thing that Duncan talked about last week was about how he does his illustrations. And I thought this was really fascinating. And if you take a look in your copy of your book, if you have it, if you look closely, you can see what he's talking about here. But he hand draws all of the pictures, and then he layers in graphically and digitally in his computer, of course, layers from different textures. And he uses paper bags for the people's skin, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then cloth for their clothing. So if you look very closely at their clothing in here, you can see some texture in there that before he said that, I really hadn't paid any attention to. But not that that's either here nor there with the story, but I do think it's interesting that he uses things from around him to make his illustrations, which is really how the Aztec word painters made their paper, as well as the dyes for their colors, from what they found around them. So that's another way that he is following in the tradition of the Aztec word painters. So thinking about ideas for teaching, are you familiar with Tonatiuh's Undocumented, A Worker's Fight? Parsa, do you know that book?
Yeah, I think I've read it, but I kind of vaguely remember the story, so I don't want to misinterpret what exactly the whole details were.
Right.
So, but it's kind of artistic. I think the illustrations and all those. So I think so there's kind of a resemblance in a way that, like using natural ways of artistic production, and I think Duncan probably tries to simulate what his ancestors used to do, like a historical replication, and which is very hard to do, but maybe because of his artistic talent he was able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I don't want to say things about the other one undocumented, and say some things which is probably not going to be exactly representation.
That's okay.
Yeah. But I'm sure the artistic part, there's a resemblance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It very much is. And it's so unusual because it comes, I wish I had it at home here. I lent it to a student, which you should never do.
I can see that.
They
Yes.
just always take it. But that's okay. I don't know.
Yeah.
They're using it. So, but it is in the form of a codex, an accordion codex. And so you literally pull it apart. And most of the Aztec codices were printed on both sides, so that you could pull out the book and look at it going, I think they went left to right, if I'm not mistaken. But then you flip it over and you're seeing sort of the rest of the story on the other side, and working working backwards. And it's a fascinating way to present a book. It my students, obviously, at least one of them, were fascinated by this when I showed it to them. They'd never seen anything like it before. And I think maybe the closest we could think of that we might have had might be, well, I think about galley proofs for one. You know, they're kind of interesting. They're not meant to be read in sequence, obviously, but you know, that's a way to pull out a story. But also, you know, the old chapbooks used to, or battle doors, you know, used to be little folded pieces of paper, and it was a way to you know, create a book in one piece. And if the other codices that they had were just separate pieces of paper, they didn't have staples, or they didn't publish their books the way we do now. So if you wanted a long story all together so that you weren't going to get the pages mixed up, the accordion style was a great way to do it. And so to have children create their own accordion style books, I think would be a really interesting way to have them record their own stories or retell other stories. I can see expanding this to make the separate pages like a story frame, turning it into theater, having them, you know, write their own plays and present them too. So it's where I probably would take it. Of course,
Actually,
yes.
I was just going to say that actually, there are publishers now of board books and books for very young babies that are adopting the accordion style, because they can stand up in front of the babies laying on their tummies. And it's simply, I mean, it's very simple. It's like different animals, and it continues on the back, but it's a living example. It's a current example of the use of accordion style books.
That's really interesting. I have not seen those, so I'm going to be looking for those now.
There's some international publishers who are starting to do that, and it's starting to come over, you know, spread. The word is spread that, you know, for young babies, this is one great way to have them use their tummy time, get their muscles, and be exposed to books.
I love that. Sure, could use that for my own tummy time.
All of us.
Yes. And of course, because I love this idea of singing the stories and dancing, and you know, you couldn't do incense in school probably, but wouldn't you love to have kids put something like that on?
That'd be wonderful.
I really want to do that. I don't know. I think, Sandeep, if we ever get together for an in-person meeting again, we should do that for our children's lit sig, for sure.
Create an accordion book.
No, have a happening, you know, with singing the stories and dancing to them.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Also, when I was teaching in the schools, I'm just in college now, but I would have docents from the Cleveland Museum of Art come and bring examples from the different cultures, because I think it helped my students, at least, be able to connect a little more to the culture. You know, I had 7th and 8th graders, and they were very myopic, and they could only see their own little world. And so for them to try to look outside of that, they you know, are very visual, of course, and tactile. And so having something to not only see but feel, and have a story told about it made it come alive a little bit more, and they would understand the books that we were looking at on a much deeper level. That and using, I don't know if you've ever done Google Lit Trips before. Are you familiar with those?
Mm.
Lit Trip.
I'm familiar with them. I taught for about 30 years, and it was pre-Google Lit Trips.
Yes.
So I haven't used them in a classroom setting, but I know about them.
They really are amazing because you can, it uses Google Maps, and you zero in on a setting in the story. And the kids like to start way out in space and then zoom really fast down in there, which always makes me dizzy when I watch them do that. But you end up in the actual setting of the story, and you can do all kinds of looking around in that area, see what's close by. Then you embed questions about the story at that particular point. So it's a way, again, for them to be able to experience a place. Of course, you know, you're only going to get contemporary stuff now, but at least, you know, you could, for a land of books, you could zero down into Mexico City, and I'm sure that there would be some hyperlinks you could go to that would show you what it used to look like, what it used to be, and when the Aztecs were there. Something I always like to do too, in terms of trying to help kids make connections between their own lives and the lives that are depicted in their books, would be to use what they already use what they already know about. And so have them write a story using just emojis. Can you do that? I can do that. If I can do that, they can do that. So, you know, and of course, you know, looking at other traditions from Mesoamerican cultures, but what other ideas can you think of that might be interesting to present with children related to this book?
One thing that springs to mind is that taking the picture and having kids decide on the story and writing the script, which is the story.
Yes.
So, and they're going to have to go through iterations of that, because I was thinking it's an argument, but then it turns out to be a marriage, and so what does that mean? So the kids will have to make a decision of what are all these pieces, and they came from all over the place, yeah, and then build details. So they could actually take that picture, and with those cues of what those things mean, and build the story. That might be one possibility.
Right. I think that would be great. I mean, you know, just letting kids go sometimes. I've always been a big believer in letting the kids teach me how to teach them. And, you know, I can come up with a million ideas. Once I get started, it's really, I go down a rabbit hole. But, you know, when I ask them to open up and say, what do you want to do with this book? It always amazes me, some of the things that they come up with.
One of the things I did that might be applicable if they're told a story, to listen to a story, is to recreate it in paper using kind of a collage style, but physically acting it out, especially the younger students. You know, it kind of triggers into the memory a little bit better, so that you can build on that as they move on. Right.
Yeah. I think if we would allow ourselves to assess children's comprehension using some of these kinds of things, and not just a computer test, they would look much more like the geniuses we know that they are. So, so I have some questions here I thought might be interesting for us to pick up on, and we have about 17 minutes left. One thing that I think might be difficult, there are so many words, Aztec words in the story that might be a little difficult, but what do you think readers would have to know about pre-Columbian culture in Mesoamerica to appreciate this book?
I think it would make sense if maybe some of the words are introduced and to talk a little bit about the words, and along with some pictures or images that can be combined with the words, or pointing to the book, like, so kind of it makes sense to introduce the words so they will recognize it when it comes in the context. And while telling the story, also when the words come within the story, then make it more visual for the children. And I think probably some pair work, if the children are working, whether the children are working, that's a teacher decision, whether the children should just collaborate or just maybe do a pair work with some of the words. And then, that would make it more, bring the culture behind each of the words, which are new to them.
Right.
So that might be even for adults, in a children's literature class where there's a glossary, then they have to learn those words. I mean, I don't mean to memorize, but at least know what these words mean. So that sort of thing is valuable. And the other thing is, I find it more engaging when they do like groups of 2 or 3, and then they share in the small groups. That's another way. So, and they can make the personal connections at that time also, like, what do you think? And the teacher might have to do a little bit of facilitation or put the questions in a board or someplace. So I think the culture part needs to be shared a little bit.
Right. I think, and even a lot of adults who aren't familiar with Mesoamerican culture, Aztec culture, would have to have some front loading in order to be able to really appreciate it. I mean, you can appreciate it on a certain level.
Yeah.
Just thinking about, oh, they're talking about how their family does these books and how important it is to write down all of these things for later generations. I think that topic is pretty accessible throughout this book. But I think what Duncan pointed out last week was that he really wants for Latinx children to read this book and to understand their history. And many of them don't know. Many of them have no idea about Mesoamerican history whatsoever, unless they were born in a place. And even then, I spent a lot of time in Guatemala, and indigenous children there went to school maybe through second grade.
Mhm.
The people who were going to school were those of Spanish descent or international students going to international schools or American schools. And I know they weren't learning about the history of the Mayans there. They might go to a Mayan ruin, but you know, they're running around and playing with the monkeys and all of that. So, you know, this whole idea of the history, I this is such an important message, and I would hate to see it get lost.
Mhm.
The importance of knowing your stories and knowing your past is just sitting heavy on my mind right now. And it puts me in mind of how much is lost when you lose those ties. And the loss isn't to ancient generations. It starts right with the people, your parents and your grandparents, the ones that you know and love.
Right.
So this book is incredibly important.
I think so too. I think it's one of the most important books that we've had published for a while. You know, you think about all of the people in the United States who, and this has happened for years and years and years. The whole idea for the kids is to become assimilated. You know, I've had kids from countries outside of the United States who didn't want to be asked about their culture at all.
Mm-hmm.
They resented me asking about, you know, well, what did you do and how did you they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to be pulled out as being different. And yet I was trying to celebrate that and to help to educate the rest of the students, who really, I think, you know, most of them were interested too, but
it's a hard thing to be different sometimes, though. And I think it's a very difficult balance, because you want to foster that confidence to know about and be curious about and share one's culture. And at the same time, it's really hard when you're in a place where you feel like you need to be the same.
yeah.
I recall, I'm thinking about what you're saying, Sue, and what you're saying, Christine, about students and their goals of their lives that may be counter to our understanding, even though it's really well intentioned. I had a Chinese student in a middle school class, English class, and he'd written an essay in which he had put his long quote in Chinese in there. I could not read it, but I knew that it had meaning that was more than just what those ideographs meant. It had a certain cultural meaning. And I like you, Sue, I very much, I thought that was wonderful. I thought it was a wonderful paragraph to include. It was a quote, and I thought it was great. I wanted to know what it meant. Thought it was wonderful. He took it out.
Oh, no.
Didn't even translate it. Just took it out because he had a vision for himself to be whatever, and it was not. It was cutting that off at the time, and God, I missed that. I missed that cue. I missed it altogether. I felt really bad, and I also felt really lonely in that he had put that away rather than to incorporate it. I felt really bad for us and for him, and for me, for the reasons that you're saying about what do we understand about someone else.
Right. I'm wondering if he did that because it was a quote, and so he thought it has to be just like where I read it from. So he that's why he put that in, and maybe he felt that he wasn't able to translate it well enough to represent an accurate depiction of the original? I don't know.
Perhaps. I don't know. I thought it was wonderful, regardless. I thought it was great. And perhaps if I asked him what does it mean, he's got, never mind then, I'll just take it out, which makes some sense.
Yeah.
But it was like you're saying, Sue, I was, wow, this is so great. But it turned out to be something I should just have possibly have ignored. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's difficult to know, what to do in those situations, especially today with all of the insanity that's happening in our country right now. I have this question about, what all of Duncan's books can really tell us about facing history and ourselves. I don't know if you're familiar with that group, but it's as though so many, I'm not going to say a majority, but way too many people in this country right now don't seem to want to face history. We don't want to look back and think about who we were and what are the implications of that today. And yet it's my very strong belief that we have to.
Yeah. Yeah.
My beliefs on anybody.
We repeat our history too easily. Far too easily.
Yeah.
In many times the worst of ways.
Right. And I worry because, he wrote this book to make sure that kids would be able to understand their culture and to pass it on. And the painters of words wrote their books, painted their books in order to not get lost in history. And it just worries me that, if we don't pay attention to books like this, are we losing them all over again? Are we wiping them out all over again? Are we burning their cities and their codices all over again? I don't think we can afford to do that.
I think you're on it, because if we lose the stories of what happened and we let that happen, and I'm seeing the larger we, not us, it is another erasure and devastation.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? I think this has been a really good discussion. I really wish that more people would have come in, because it is important that we get as many people as possible talking about not just this book, but this whole idea. And I'm excited that we were here, though, and hoping that maybe if this recording reaches people, they'll reach out to us maybe, and we can continue the conversation